husband, father, artist, slave, survivor. The life and trials of one Solomon Northup are brilliantly and vividly realized by director Steve McQueen and screenwriter John Ridley's adaptation of Northup's 1853 memoir, 12 Years a Slave. This film dares to depict slavery in a bold and brutally honest way that no other slave narrative on screen has done before. Not Amistad, not Django Unchained, not even Roots, which up until the release of 12 Years a Slave was widely considered to be the definitive on-screen depiction of slavery for over 35 years. Chiwetel Ejiofor stars as Solomon Northup, an African-American free man living in New York with his family, his wife Anne, their son Alonzo, and daughter Margaret. And life has been relatively kind to Solomon. In addition to being a loving family man, he also happens to be a talented violinist. And one day in 1841, he receives an offer by a pair of traveling entertainers to perform in Washington, D.C. But shortly after he arrives there, he is drugged, kidnapped, and then sold into slavery, and for the next 12 years of his life suffers unimaginable physical and psychological cruelty. I have so much to say about this film, and I will get into several aspects of it, including the ending. And with that in mind, if you have not seen the film yet, then please stop this video essay. I urge you to go watch the film first. Trust me, you will gain more from this video essay once you have seen the film. Now that that's out of the way, let us explore this powerful and painful American Odyssey. One of the elements that makes 12 Years a Slave resonate so deeply is how it addresses the theme of exceptionalism, the notion that if you are of a certain status, be it economical, racial, or whatever, then you are afforded fair and just treatment. You're entitled to a certain level of respect from your peers and others, and for Solomon Northup, this was true. Here you have a respected and respectable family man who happens to be a talented artist, living in a state where neither he nor his family are subservient to anyone. There's one flashback scene which illustrates Solomon's social exceptionalism, in which he and his family visit a store to purchase some items for their travels, and Solomon's chatting it up with the store owner, like one equal to another. And while this is going on, a young black man stares at them from afar, and he's awestruck at the sight of Solomon and his family. Free black people who have autonomy, clad in fine attire, and who answer to no master? Is this possible? Could this be possible for me? These questions have probably swirled in this young man's mind as he tentatively walks into the store and is about to address Solomon when a grim, older white man rushes in and demands his servant to leave. When the owner of the young man apologizes for the intrusion, Solomon remarks that no harm was done, no worries, and the white slave owner glares at him with incredulity and confusion before trotting off. Solomon resumes his conversation with the store owner. Here, we have a free black man who has yet to understand or acknowledge the tenuous false sense of security that enables Solomon's perceived ignorance of slavery. The illusory belief that Solomon is a different kind of black person, a middle-class man who is surely nothing like the slaves that toil away in the South. As Solomon finds out when he is kidnapped and awakens in a dark cell, shackled and now adorned in ragged white undergarments, his sense of security is broken, never to be restored again. To the slave catchers who subsequently beat him within an inch of his life, he is not Solomon Northup. Instead, he is a Georgia runaway slave with no free papers on his person. His new identity and name is Platt, a plain name for a faceless slave with no history. In one of the film's many potent shots, Solomon shambles to the barred window of his dark cell, reeling from the beating he just took, and feebly utters, "Help me," as the camera glides up and reveals the US Capitol building on the horizon. This brief shot provides a very hard lesson for Solomon, that as a black person, his voice, his pain, his humanity is invalid in the eyes of the law. Sure, he was legally free before his kidnapping, but this shot to me shows just how strange and incongruous it is to consider any so-called free black person in 19th century America free people, when in actuality, their freedom was strictly relative. Note that the dome of the Capitol building is unfinished. Much progress on the road to racial equality is still to come. and it's already too late for too many. Another scene finds Solomon on the plantation of William Ford, who was a rather benevolent slave owner. Ugh, just saying that leaves a bad taste in my mouth. Anyway, Ford has just purchased Solomon and a slave woman named Eliza, who is wailing non-stop because her 2 children were taken from her and sold. Irritated by her crying, Solomon tells Eliza to stop, and she replies with some hard truths regarding their situation. She tells him that she did dishonorable things to survive, and that even if she stood up for herself, she would not have ended up anywhere different. Furthermore, Eliza reminds Solomon that as gentle as Master Ford is under the circumstances, he is still a slaver, and asks Solomon if he actually believes that Ford is truly unaware of his real identity. Eliza's insinuation of Ford's willful ignorance of Solomon's true past is backed up when Solomon, despite gaining his new master's favor by applying his engineering experience to move logs through a swamp and gracing everyone with his violin-playing abilities, has to face facts when Ford tells him that he looks forward to many years of Platt's servitude. Aside from Solomon himself, the film follows another character who embodies the dark and twisted side of exceptionalism. This character is Patsy, unforgettably portrayed by Lupita Nyong'o, a female slave who is simultaneously the object of pride and punishment of her sadistic master, Edwin Epps, played by Michael Fassbender. More on his role shortly. Patsy is the only slave who picks over 500 pounds of cotton every day on Epps's plantation, more than any other slave, and her efforts are met with vocal, open praise by her master, as well as with horrifying violence by her master as well. Patsy's life is the living example of the expression, damned if you do, damned if you don't. It doesn't matter that she picks more cotton than her fellow prisoners, or if Solomon is a gifted violinist, or if Eliza once held her old master's favor before she and her kids were sold. Slave or free, in the words of William Ford to Solomon, whatever your circumstances, you are an exceptional nigga. I fear no good will come of it. 12 Years a Slave perfectly captures the cognitive dissonance that was pervasive on all levels in American society, and the willful ignorance required to sustain the odious institution of slavery. Look at the 2 slave masters William Ford and Edwin Epps, 2 slavers who seem to contrast each other quite strongly. You know, besides the whole slave-owning operation, Ford seems to be a fairly decent man, and according to the real Solomon Northup in his memoir, quote, "The influences and associations that had always surrounded Ford blinded him to the inherent wrong at the bottom of the system of slavery." No matter how many sermons he preaches, how many Bible verses he quotes from, or how fairly he treats Solomon personally, it doesn't change the fact that he directly contributes to the very evil he seems to oppose. And how benevolent could Ford really be when he employs a crew of contemptuous, bullying overseers, in particular that weaselly little shit of a man, John Tabitz? Moral cowardice is Ford's shield. Edwin Epps, on the other hand, has absolutely no pretense of benevolence. Like Ford, he also uses scripture to justify slavery. However, he quotes certain verses which basically state that all slaves must obey their master, lest they receive the master's wrath. The most polite thing I can say about Epps and his wife Mistress Epps is that they are 2 of the biggest, vilest, meanest motherfucking assholes I have ever seen in any film. Edwin relishes in his twisted, demented authority, so much so that at one point he terrorizes his slaves by waking them up in the middle of the night and forcing them to dance in his home, strictly for his own drunken amusement. Patsy, Edwin's object of loathing and lust, catches the worst of it when Mistress Epps attacks her twice, while verbally emasculating her husband in the process. Regarding Patsy and Edwin, there's a point where he takes her in the middle of the night and rapes her. During this ordeal, Patsy lies silent and tries to mentally disassociate herself from the moment. Noticing this, Edwin strikes her in anger, and after he is finished, he tearfully looks upon Patsy with a mixture of satisfaction, disgust, and confused fear. He does not want to accept the truth that he is bewitched by his own slave. This truth is so unbearable in his mind that this further fuels his zeal in torturing Patsy. An equally disturbing moment comes later when Edwin welcomes his new slaves back to his plantation after sending them off to work at another for summer. While Edwin is talking to Solomon, dressed in a white night robe as if he was just newly baptized, he is holding a little slave girl in his arms. Patsy's working nearby, her right eye bloodshot from yet another beating. What a sick, monstrous man, watching this wretch Edwin doting on this child as if grooming her to be his new Patsy. I shudder to think of all that implies. Another dimension of the societal cognitive dissonance during slavery is explored in a brief yet highly distinctive scene where Solomon meets Mistress Shaw, the wife of her master now turned husband. She is having tea with Patsy, who regards the mistress with silent reverence and amazement, much like the young slave man who looked at Solomon with stunned awe years prior in Solomon's pre-kidnapping days. It seems that in Patsy's eyes, Mistress Shaw represents new and hopeful possibilities. This peculiar scene stands out as a sort of a weird, hellish Alice in Wonderland dream sequence in the midst of the brutality that precedes and follows it. Mistress Shaw relishes in her comforted, protected status as her master's wife, taking pride in having the other slaves she worked alongside before now serving her. And she gleefully puts on airs of superiority by addressing Solomon as Nigger Platt, and he to her as Mistress. It's like a twisted parody of slave and master relations, and it's bizarrely subversive in its own right because Mistress Shaw remarks that divine retribution will befall the plantation class eventually. As happy as she is in her lofty, protected position, she takes a pragmatic view of her situation. It's not about love, or being a showpiece trophy for her master/husband. It's strictly business and survival. One should also note that unlike Edwin, Master Shaw has the boldness to openly embrace his torrid affections towards one of his slaves. Steve McQueen's 3 feature films center on body horror, and not of the Alien and David Cronenberg's The Fly variety either. In Hunger, IRA member Bobby Sands undergoes a hunger strike which sees him wasting away until death. In Shame, the main character Brandon is a sex addict whose appetite is so compulsive that all of his sexual encounters are more torturous than titillating. 12 Years a Slave exhibits body horror of a different sort, with various shots of slaves bound with shackles and inhumane metal muzzles around their mouths. Their backs and faces thick and leathery with whip-induced scars, fresh welts on top of old ones. We see the vacant, 1,000-yard stares from some of the slaves, the hope and potential selves that they could have been in another time and place have long been beaten out of them. Their eyes alone have seen too much of the unspeakable. As in Hunger and Shame, McQueen uses long takes in 12 Years a Slave to accentuate the character's suffering in an explicitly honest manner. There are 2 long takes in particular that are tremendously unforgettable, the first of which is Solomon's hours-long hanging in the noose, after he rightfully kicks the hell out of that sweaty little shithead overseer to beats. Solomon struggles to stand on his tippy toes on the muddy ground as he desperately fights to breathe. The mud beneath his feet threatens to yield its support. As he is hanging, the other slaves go about their business, and even the slave children play in the background, while Solomon's face is out of focus in the foreground. The camera tells us in this moment that Solomon does not exist to the rest of the slaves. For all they know, they could just as easily be swinging in the breeze on the end of that noose. Best not to acknowledge it, and keep their heads down. The second long take. Oh man. The second long take sees Patsy being stripped, tied to a post, and whipped mercilessly by Edwin for the grievous crime of receiving a piece of soap from the Shaw plantation nearby. Indignant and at her wit's end, she admonishes Edwin because she picks so much cotton every day that she cannot stand her own stench. All she wants is to be clean and have a tiny shred of dignity, just a tiny bit. For her grievances, Edwin forces Solomon to whip her. and when he reluctantly does so, the asshole furiously finishes the job, turning Patsy's back into an open wall of crimson. Now, on a filmmaking level, this scene was masterfully executed, as it was visceral and intense. In the context of the story, the long, unbroken take forces us to endure every single second and minute of this terrible savagery. For those uncomfortably long and fearful minutes, we are right there in Patsy's and Solomon's shoes, and the long take provides an immediacy which would have been diminished with conventional cutting from angle to angle. The subsequent scene shows the awful results of the bodily horrors inflicted on Patsy, as the other slaves are treating her latest wounds. This moment feels equally as painful as her whipping. So much pain has been inflicted on Patsy, and we know that so much more will eventually follow. The mental, psychological horrors are amplified by the bodily horrors experienced by Solomon, Patsy, and others in the film. Earlier, I talked about the notion of exceptionalism in regards to free black individuals like Solomon and how this was eradicated under slavery. One way this eradication was achieved was by forcing slaves to conceal their intelligence, for if it was discovered that a slave was in fact literate, that meant certain death. When Solomon tries to get a letter out to New York via a seemingly understanding white field hand who immediately betrays him, Edwin confronts Solomon and menacingly inquires about it. Solomon narrowly convinces Edwin that he wrote no letters, that it was all a lie, and all the while during this scene, Edwin has his arm wrapped around Solomon's shoulder. He has a knife pointed at Solomon's gut and stares into his eyes silently for what feels like an eternity, unmoving, unblinking. I was afraid to even exhale watching this because of Edwin's unpredictable psychopathic tendencies. Dismayed, Solomon burns the letter after Edwin leaves him alone. The dream of freedom is dead. Patsy also experiences mental horrors of the worst kind, so much so that after she is raped by Edwin, she begs Solomon to kill her. He refuses. Also adding to the mental horrors of slavery is that the film does not provide intertitles to chronicle Solomon's years in forced servitude. Now, this was a wise choice by the filmmakers, for it illustrates clearly how Solomon's life during these 12 years was just one merciless blur. One other element that further contributes to the disturbing nature of the film is the beautifully captured cinematography by Sean Bobbitt, the cinematographer of Steve McQueen's first two features, as well as The Place Beyond the Pines. Periodically in 12 Years a Slave, the camera weaves its way across the genuinely gorgeous landscapes of the Louisiana plantations, almost Terrence Malick-like in the way it moves past the numerous trees and swamplands, which are all stained with the blood and bones of innocent lives. Watching these transitional sequences, as well as the key scenes of the film, I thought of the haunting song, Strange Fruit, most famously performed by the great Billie Holiday. How many slaves, men, women, children, hung from those branches? The indelible score by Hans Zimmer also lends further gravitas to the rest of the film's proceedings. Near the film's last moments, there is one close-up shot of Solomon's face as he looks around with anxiety and bewilderment. In the scene prior to this moment, Solomon had secretly revealed his true background and his incredible tale of woe to a Canadian carpenter named Bass, who lends a sympathetic ear to the man. Bass, at great personal risk, gives his word to Solomon that he will write a letter for him to send help his way. As Solomon is looking around in his close-up, his eyes wander towards the camera and his gaze stops, staring directly at us for what seems like forever. This moment really hit me, because as a viewer, I had the benefit and barrier of distance, but Solomon's direct gaze shattered that barrier and closed that gap. Throughout the entire film, Solomon has had his personhood denied, disrespected, and denigrated, and his gaze at us challenges us to acknowledge his ordeal, his blackness, his humanity. Additionally, this moment also challenges us to acknowledge and understand the very reality and history of slavery itself. As a viewer, will you avert your eyes and tell us to, move on, forget about it? It was so long ago, why are we still talking about this? Or will you pay attention? Finally, at long last, Solomon is rescued, and he and Patsy share one final embrace before he rides away from Edwin Epps' plantation for good. Patsy, in shock, faints. When Solomon last saw his family, he was a father, and now that he's finally returning home, he finds himself a grandfather. His son and daughter are now all grown up. His daughter Margaret is married and has a son, which she named after her dad. And this moment, by the way, hit me like a bullet train. I mean, how can you not weep during this scene? It's impossible. Solomon, his 2 kids, his new son-in-law, and his wife Anne all share one group embrace together. After 12 long, agonizing years, Solomon has returned home, and his name will endure. Now, as joyous as this reunion is, the ending is so bittersweet. As happy as we are for Solomon to survive his ordeal and reunites with his family, Patsy is still trapped in that hellish Louisiana plantation. We do not know what ultimately became of her, and long after I've watched this film, I still think about Patsy and what her fate was. Did Epps and/or his wife finally kill her? Did she eventually become a Mistress Patsy Epps like Mistress Shaw? Extremely unlikely, and too grotesque to consider. Ugh. Did she finally summon the courage to end her own life on her own terms? Or did she escape to freedom? Whatever her fate was, I really wish we knew. Furthermore, the date and circumstances surrounding Solomon's death are still unknown to this day. After he regained his freedom, he gave dozens of lectures about his experiences as a slave and was even involved in the Underground Railroad. Unfortunately, he and his legal counsel were unable to bring his kidnappers to justice, thanks to Washington, D.C. laws that prohibited Solomon from testifying against white people because he was black. And this brings me back to that shot of the unfinished Capitol dome that we saw earlier in the film. And this just shows how, once again, even as a free man, Solomon and his kind were not truly free. America's laws were not in place to have his best interests in mind. As with Patsy, I really wish we knew what happened to Solomon. Was he killed or captured again during his travels on the lecture circuit? Quite frankly, I do not want to believe that. Did he go into hiding? Did he choose to live his final years in relative anonymity? Who knows? But in any case, thanks to Steve McQueen, John Ridley, Chiwetel Ejiofor, Lupita Nyong'o, and the entire cast of 12 Years a Slave, we have here one of the most powerful American stories in history, and today we now know the name of Solomon Northup. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I'm Victor Omoayo, and you can find more video essay goodness right here on the Victor Omoayo channel.